Do you work or live in an environment where the people around you are constantly making subtle and regular insulting and degrading comments because of your race, your gender, your sexual preference? Well, if you do, these are classic acts of microaggressions that over time can cause you to experience symptoms similar to experiencing or witnessing actual or threatened death or serious injury. How can you protect your mental health and fight back against this subtle but impactful form of discrimination? My guests today have answers.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
Yesterday, former Miami Dolphins coach Brian Flores sued the NFL and all 32 teams, alleging racial discrimination on behalf of Black executives and head coaches. Flores claims that he was denied a coaching job with the New York Giants because of his race, that he was forced to participate in sham interviews, and was fired from the Miami Dolphins for refusing to accept a $100,000 bribe to purposely lose games so that the team could get a better draft pick. The NFL has no Black owners. 75% of its players are Black, and only one of the existing 27 coaches is African American. Flores' explosive lawsuit is bound to shake the foundation of professional football. In filing the suit, he issued a statement acknowledging that he knew that doing so could ruin his career in sports forever. But he said he had to stand up. He had to call out the rank discrimination and hypocrisy that plagues the NFL. And he is right. Calling out discrimination and challenging a highly financed organization like the NFL can be the death knell of anyone's career, particularly a Black coach. I give Brian Flores a lot of credit for having the courage to call out the NFL for its pathetic diversity numbers and its treatment of Black coaches and executives. We remember what the league did to Colin Kaepernick. And thankfully, Brian Flores has the skilled attorneys, experienced attorneys who are going to help him hopefully obtain compensation for not being offered the position with the Giants and for being fired because of basically refusing to engage in a potentially illegal and definitely unethical conduct with the Miami Dolphins. But what about those subtle acts of discrimination that go unchallenged in the workplace every day? Those degrading and discriminatory comments and actions which may not rise to the level of proof required for a civil lawsuit, but which are emotionally and psychologically traumatizing. There must be some way that all of us can address what has been commonly referred to as microaggressions. Here for our leadoff discussion is psychologist, professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, and author of several books, including Microaggressions and Traumatic Stress. He is credited with having mainstreaming the phrase microaggressions after it was introduced by Dr. Chester Pierce in the 1970s. Welcome to the show, Dr. Kevin Nadal.
Thank you, Areva. I'm very happy to be here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nadal, for joining me. I wanted to start the show talking about that Brian Flores lawsuit because as a civil rights attorney, I'm really, disturbed by the response by the NFL to the lawsuit. Of course, this is the early stages. No discovery has taken place, but the immediate response was that the NFL has this tremendous commitment to diversity. Yet you look at the numbers of coaches, one Black coach out of 27, no Black owners, 75% of the players are African American, and you have to question, how serious that commitment to diversity is. It seems like to me it's a commitment to maintaining the status quo and centering whiteness. But we know how difficult it is when someone like Flores files a racial discrimination case. I mean, it could be the end of his career in sports, but yet he had the courage to do so. Today we're talking, though, about not those actions like Flores is claiming, which, rises to the level that allows him to go into a federal court, a state court, and file a lawsuit, but those acts that take place every day in the workplace, sometimes in the home and in the community, that, eat away at people and are actual forms of discrimination. I know you've spent a lot of years researching what we now call microaggressions. So I want to just start by asking you to just explain to the viewers, what are microaggressions?
Yeah, I'm happy to do so. One of the things that just to quickly comment on the Flores case is that what's happening in the NFL happens across workplaces of many sectors across the country. You're talking about the NFL, I'm talking about corporations in which there are very few CEOs of color, very few women of color as CEOs, even in academia, right? I'm at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is one of the largest Latino serving institutions in the United States, yet 75% of our professors are white, while 75% of our students are students of color. So this is something that happens everywhere. And it's really baffling how people can say that they're committed to diversity, but their numbers just don't show it. In many ways, that is in itself a microaggression. This idea that they're well-intentioned, they believe that they are really doing things to advance equity and justice, when in reality, they're not. And so when we think about—
Stop you, Professor Nadal, because you just said something that really resonates with me. The concept that saying that you're committed to diversity when your numbers tell a completely different story, the fact that in and of itself, some might call it gaslighting, right? Like you're trying to convince us that something is true that clearly is not true, because if you had a real commitment to diversity, these numbers would look differently, particularly when we know, as you said, in the case of academia or in the NFL, if 75% of your players are Black, that means there will be a lot of folks who are going to be qualified to coach in the NFL. You got like this talent pool, that's just, automatic talent pool. So thank you for, calling out the fact that when companies say they're committed to diversity, but their numbers aren't there, that's a form of a microaggression.
Yes. So microaggressions, are these sometimes brief, sometimes long-lasting, subtle forms of discrimination. Usually, they're unintentional, sometimes unconscious. People don't realize that they're committing them. And there are a bunch of these corporations, including the NFL, that might genuinely think that they are committed to diversity, but their actions speak otherwise. The gaslighting that occurs is part of being a part of the microaggressions, invalidating people's experiences, telling people it's all in your head, you think about race too much, you think about sexism too much. That's not true. They're negating people's realities. But for those of us who've experienced many microaggressions, especially those who have multiple marginalized identities, this is our everyday life. This is what we recognize as soon as we step foot into the workplace. And it's something that's palpable, that research studies have found, people are able to identify, and that research has found has had detrimental impacts on things like mental health, even physical health. The more microaggressions that people experience, they're likely to report things like depression, anxiety, trauma, and even physical health issues.
It's so interesting that even the reporting on the Brian Flores' case, I've been listening to some of the reporters, talk about it on different news programs. And there's this almost kind of a sense of incredulity, like doubting that these allegations are true, or somehow maybe, you're a coach, you make a lot of money. Why are you complaining? It's a tough field. Everybody, experiences, terminations in the NFL. But I haven't heard anyone really, report the story as if this could really be a true case of discrimination, or even giving him credit for calling it out when everybody knows what the numbers are. So what do you make of that as a society? Have we just become so, accustomed to seeing these kinds of horrific numbers that we just accept it as the status quo?
Yeah, one of the things that comes up for me is the old African proverb that says that until the lioness learns how to write, we will always hear the narrative of the hunter. And that's exactly what's happening here. People in power, people who have access to the media, are saying that Flores's statements that his case is unfounded. How could he possibly be saying that racism exists in the NFL? When in reality, if you asked everyday people, not just in the NFL, but across different professional sports organizations, and again, again, other sectors as well, you would find that this is our reality. We realize and recognize that there is all sorts of racism that manifests in different ways, maybe not in terms of this overt hostile discrimination that we may have seen in the past, or even just this overt type of discrimination that Flores describes, but the subtle types of microaggressions that people experience in their everyday life. And so I think one of the things that we have to do, you mentioned earlier, is we have to decenter whiteness. We have to examine the perspectives of the historically oppressed. We have to really take the time to understand what the people are actually experiencing and not just look at it from what the people who have privilege are thinking or how they see the world, but really understanding the perspectives of those who encounter these things every day of their lives.
Yeah, it's so interesting, Dr. Nadal, how different groups view this. Like I asked some of my friends, male friends who are sports figures or sports fans, what do they think about this lawsuit? And two, almost, unanimously, my male friends, African-American male friends, big sports fans, all said, look, I love football, but I have to watch it and kind of separate my logic from, my enjoyment of the sport. And, many call it, a modern day plantation because you have all these white owners and all of these, Black players on the field, but no hardly any representation at the executive level and the ownership level. And one guy said, look, I do it, but it's painful oftentimes to even watch it. And, know that I'm being somehow complicit in supporting the sport and, holding it up and helping make it profitable. So those are choices I guess all of us have to make each and every day, whether it's, supporting football and watching football or, shopping at a store where we know the policies of, the CEOs or the management don't reflect our values.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's something that, really came to light years ago now with Colin Kaepernick and how he was been treated by the organization. There have been lots of calls to try to boycott or ban the NFL, but people love the sport so much because it's been such a part of their identities and their lives that it's hard to let go. I mean, and it's not just football. It's things like watching a television show that has been historically unrepresentative of people of color or of diverse experiences in general. Shopping in places that where their politics might not be reflective of yours, or even just participating in anything that promotes capitalism. We do things, we make choices, but I think once we start to really speak out more and more, then maybe we'll see that we have other alternatives, right? And I think that if people are, especially those who are able to support these industries, if they're more vocal of wanting change, and people actually did boycott this organization and others, then maybe that's when actual change could actually be seen and felt.
Yeah, I want to ask you about another form of microaggression. We see it all the time on social media posts. So Republican John Kennedy made this statement as it relates to nominating a Black woman to the Supreme Court. He said, number one, I want a nominee who knows a law book from a J. Crew catalog. I don't know if that's a microaggression or a straight out just aggression. What category you put that in?
I mean, you can call them both. I mean, I think sometimes people say things that are so outlandish that for some of us who hear it, we're like, that is straight up an aggression. But if you challenge them, they'll say like, no, that's not what I meant, or that wasn't their intention. And who knows what their intention is? We're not inside of their heads, but we know what the impact was. The impact was that it was offensive, implying that Black women or other women of color just wouldn't have the ability to be a Supreme Court justice. And, it's interesting how all these people are saying it's all about identity politics. Why are we thinking about race and gender and picking a Supreme Court justice? Well, look, we've been picking the same race and the same gender for Supreme Court justice for centuries. And so that's identity politics. If we think about it, they're the ones who are trying to maintain the identity of the Supreme Court instead of trying to make sure that it reflects the country that it's supposed to serve.
Yeah, it was always the unspoken identity politics that you had to be white and you had to be male. So, wasn't spoken out loud, but that was clearly what the criteria was for getting a nomination and then getting confirmed to the Supreme Court. And as long as those were the standards that were, being upheld, we didn't hear all this talk about identity politics. Let's talk about some examples of microaggression. I was reading, some of the literature that you've written, And again, here's some examples that I don't know what people think about. I love the one where you said a white woman steps into, or a white woman's in an elevator,
Yep.
and a black guy gets on an elevator and she clutches her purse.
Yep.
And how often that happens to black guys, that just their physical presence in a space, an elevator, a room, a store, a parking lot, causes this fear and this reaction, oftentimes from white people, white women in the case of this example, where they clutch their purse or they do something to suggest, I think you're menacing. I think you're violent. I think you're a threat to me. Is that like a common and classic example of a microaggression?
Yeah, it's a very classic example of a microaggression, not just because it's something that happens to Black men often, as our research studies have found, and that anecdotally you can ask Black men about that experience, but also because it shows all of the nuances of microaggressions. That microaggressions can happen in all of just a few seconds. She clutched her purse, she moved to the right or left of him, maybe made a face, and that 3 seconds may have caused him a lot of pain. He might not admit to it, but maybe now his day is ruined. He's annoyed. He's reminded that racism exists. He feels belittled, dehumanized, as if she's treating him as if he's going to do something violent. And that act of microaggression in itself, when it might not feel like it's that damaging, but when that happens every day of your life, then that accumulation of microaggressions may end up feeling really despairing and might lead to things like mental health issues, might challenge people to think about or to feel lower self-esteem and things like that. And, there are also real practical reasons why these microaggressions are bad, right? We all know about the increased knowledge or awareness of Karens and people who call the police on Black people. So when you presume that a Black person is dangerous or violent, you call the police on them. And we know what happens when police get called to situations that they don't need to be called into, that puts these Black men's lives at danger. So there is various impacts of these microaggressions, from making somebody to feel upset, sad, frustrated, a toll on their mental health, to even just the practical tolls that it might have on his safety.
Right. Give us some other examples, Professor Nadal, of microaggressions that happen every day that we may, just overlook, we may gloss over.
Yeah, a lot of microaggressions that happen in the workplace are very well-intentioned and actually supposed to be like compliments. So anytime somebody asks a Black woman or other women of color anything about their hair, that could be a microaggression. Can I touch your hair? Oh, your hair looks so pretty today. How did you get your hair like that? And again, while it's meant to be a compliment or meant to be small chat, it's something that women of color will say is annoying. That they don't say this to white women, they don't say this to white men. But so why are you having these conversations with them when this isn't something that you would say to others? For other people, it might be things related to language. Telling an Asian American person, "You speak really good English. Has anyone ever told you that?" Or asking a Latino person something like, "Well, where are you from?" And then they say like, "Oh, I'm from New York." And you say, "Where are you really from?" Suggesting that they couldn't possibly be from where they're saying.
Yeah, as you mentioned the one about the language, I'm thinking of Donald Trump. He was a classic microaggressor in press conferences. When Asian reporter would ask him a question, he would like, right. "I can't hear you, I can't understand," get all dramatic, obviously mocking the person's accent and creating all this drama around the person's language, and that happens, as you said, to people who maybe have an accent or who are from a different country and English isn't their first language. We see that happen quite frequently.
And pay attention to
speaking loudly, like they're not deaf.
Right. And pay attention to whose accents that happens to. If you have somebody who's from Australia or from Britain and they have an accent, nobody does that, right? They do it to specific types of accents. People who come from non-white, non-Western countries, there's this idea that we can't understand them, when in reality, they're speaking English as clearly as most other people are.
Yeah, no, those are really great examples. So these microaggressions we talked about with respect to race, we know you said gender as it relates to Black women and hair, but even people's sexual preference. One of the examples I read in your literature was saying, "Oh, that's so gay." Mm-hmm. Why is that a microaggression?
Yeah, lots of language that in some ways implies that being LGBTQ is bad, inferior. When you say that's so gay, usually what people are saying is that's so bad, that's so weird, I don't like it. So instead of simply saying that's weird, I don't like it, they say that's so gay. And so they're making gay synonymous with the terms weird or bad. And so imagine being a 14-year-old kid struggling with their identity, perhaps thinking that they might be gay or queer or lesbian, and then hearing people use homophobic language over and over again. Perhaps that might be something that might prevent them from feeling good about themselves and maybe from even coming out. Another common thing that people say are things like no homo, or they'll call people trannies, all these very derogatory words that are supposed to be just part of everyday American vernacular, but the hidden meanings in some of these things demonstrate that people have biases. And it's one thing if people just don't know that these words are harmful or hurtful or offensive. But what happens is when somebody points it out to them, they'll say things like, well, it's just words. Like, why are you making such a big deal out of it? Well, if somebody tells you that you're hurting their feelings, why would you continue to do that, right? If somebody's telling you that research shows that when people hear these expressions, that it has a negative impact on things like depression or even suicidality, why would we want to continue in that behavior? And especially when there are so many alternatives. If you don't like something, just say, I don't like it. That's weird. That's gross. Don't need to bring gay people into it.
Yeah, you mentioned a little earlier the concept of intent, where people may not intentionally, be trying to hurt your feeling or make an offensive statement. So in the context of, a civil lawsuit like the one that Brian Flores filed, the person's intent is not going to be significant in terms of, how the evidence will either fall in favor of the plaintiff, Brian, or the defendants, the NFL and the teams. The evidence in those kinds of lawsuits, they're going to be looking at like that text message from Bill Belichick to Flores, 3 days after they've already given the job to the white guy. I mean, that's going to be like a smoking gun piece of evidence that interview that he was doing was just for, show, complete sham, pretense, pretextual. But in the case of these microaggressions, should we, try to get into the mindset of people? Should we give them a pass if they say, well, I didn't really intend that, I wasn't trying to hurt your feelings? How much should we care about intent when so much evidence is out there about how offensive some of these comments are?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the things that makes it harder for microaggressions specifically to be dealt with in the court of law is that we can never really fully prove what somebody's intent is. However, what attorneys can do is potentially create a pattern of how people have acted and how their biases might be demonstrated through their behaviors. At the same time, one thing that's really important is there are a lot of people outside of the world of civil rights and racism who get charged for a lot of things that they did not intend to do, right? There was the case, I don't remember any of these people's names, but the truck driver who didn't intend to run into people and then gets charged with life sentences because of a mistake that he made. And so why is it that when it comes to things like that have to do with things outside of race and justice and all those things, why does intent not matter for that? But when intent comes to microaggressions, that people say, well, we can't prove that. What that meant is because the damage is there. Why does the damage matter for other things, but not for discrimination?
So help us understand how we navigate. Again, outside of lawsuits, which as a civil rights lawyer, I'm all in favor of lawsuits when there is, discrimination. Call it out and, if the evidence is there, file that lawsuit, because that's how we get to change in this country. That's how we, cause corporations to hire more people of color, to promote more people of color, to hire more women. It's because of landmark, civil rights lawsuits that were filed. So lawyers play and courts play a big role in making the workplace, a more, equitable place. Can't do it all, but definitely play a role. But, those situations that occur that aren't going to end up in lawsuits, how should we handle it in the workplace? Over the last 18 months or so, Black folks have said, look, we are not responsible for educating every other race about what it means to be Black, what it means to have, been oppressed for decades in this country. So what should the person that is the recipient of the microaggression, how should they handle it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you're absolutely right. Like, I don't think that it is the role of Black people to educate every single person about how to navigate oppression. And in fact, my original thought as you were starting to speak was that this is why companies have to act now. They shouldn't necessarily have to only react to situations, react to court cases, but they have to be proactive in creating this environment in which everyone feels safe, everyone feels included, in which issues related to justice, equity, and diversity are talked about every single day. These shouldn't be conversations that only happen after something bad happens, but it should be something that we think about regularly. It shouldn't be just hiring a one-time diversity consultant to come in and give a training, but can be something that can be talked about every single day. And one of the things that I think companies should be aware of is that there has been research that has been found that when companies do integrate justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion into their policies and their everyday practices, that those companies end up being way more productive. So it's not just that we want people to feel safe, which of course is obviously a huge benefit, but they actually benefit the company as productivity as well. Yes, I think one of the things that I would say first for Black people and for other historically marginalized groups is I hope that they can find other folks who they can find support in, to know that they shouldn't have to tackle these companies' issues all by themselves, that there can be solidarity groups who can address these diversity issues, bring them to the table, and really that I hope the heads of these companies can really listen to what their employees and even any other constituents are saying, and because they really should be committed to equity.
What about on the individual level? If you are personally the recipient, either in the workplace, this could happen in your own family. So it's not just, workplaces where microaggressions happen. What do you advise for the individual who, may be experiencing this from a friend, a coworker, or someone on a, somewhat regular basis? How should they respond?
Yeah, I think the one thing that's really important for people who experience microaggressions is to do everything you can to learn that you're not alone, that these things that happen to you, as isolating as they might be, as even very specific as they might be, if you even just search the internet, search social media, you'll find that these things happen to everybody, which also makes us realize that microaggressions are a systemic problem. They're not just these individual things that happen. There's these individual things that happen because of systemic oppression and the ways that oppression trickles down and manifests on the individual interpersonal level. So I encourage people to just do some searches, find that they're not alone, find your people, find your support system, make sure that you externalize all of the different feelings that you have instead of internalizing them. So something that a lot of people, historically marginalized groups do, is we internalize oppression, we internalize racism, we think something was our fault, that it was our bad, that we did something wrong. When we speak at it out loud and we're able to talk about it with our friends and family members who say like, no, that sounds pretty racist. No, that sounds like that was their bias, their prejudice. It helps us to release it, because we also know that people of color tend to have more health disparities, are often prone to mental health issues because we carry a lot with us. And part of that is also this concept of racial trauma, that we're coming from generations of people who have been oppressed, whether it's from slavery, from genocide, from colonialism. We have our ancestors and all the traumas that they've experienced that have been translated down to us. And so, we have to talk about these things more, so that we no longer internalize things and that we begin our healing process, our radical healing process.
Very well said, Professor Nadal. But what about, should we, people who experience this, should we be confronting the person, the microaggressor? Should we call them out? Should we say, look, that's unacceptable, or what you just said was racist or sexist? How should we, on an individual basis, do you recommend that kind of confrontation?
Yeah, I absolutely recommend that confrontation whenever you feel that it is safe, it's appropriate, or it's effective. For some people, it might feel like I can do that. I can talk with my colleague about this. I don't think they're going to be that defensive, or I don't think it's going to have a major impact on things like me getting fired or me not getting that promotion. But for others who fear things like that, maybe they have to think of other alternatives. Maybe they have to write everything down, treat it like as if it's any other workplace harassment case, document everything, and go to human resources, go to an ombudsperson, and so that the person who is committing these microaggressions can't take it out on you, which is something that we know people fear. There's a real fear that you might lose your job if you confront these microaggressions. However, if maybe if you find that support, confront it as a group and not just an individual level, maybe again go to other sources, to human resources and so forth. Maybe that can be helpful. I mean, one thing I think is really beneficial of living in this post 2020 George Floyd world, which had always been in existence, we must acknowledge, right? That racism and police brutality has always been in existence. But for some reason in 2020, amidst this pandemic, it made people pay attention more. I think we are still at this moment where we can have these conversations where people are still listening. They're not listening as much as they were in mid-2020, but they're still sort of listening. And that these can be the opportunities for us to call out these behaviors. People, it shouldn't be a surprise anymore, versus before 2020, they could have been completely gaslit. But maybe there are some opportunities where people are listening because they've gained a little bit of awareness.
What would you, if you could get into the heads of these microaggressors? We've been talking about the folks who are the recipient of the aggressions, but what about the people who are engaged in this, conduct, the subtle, demeaning, degrading conduct? How would you start to try to change their behaviors?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important is just to understand that anyone who engages in this behavior is really just a product of the society that they were raised. And I think a lot of times people don't realize that that's the case, and for people who come from privilege, a lot of times they don't have that empathy because they've never had to have that empathy. They don't know what discrimination is or can't empathize when somebody says they've been discriminated against because they haven't faced that themselves. And I think this is something that can be a real effective way of getting somebody to at least be open to understanding microaggressions is this idea of empathy, for asking somebody to imagine what you think it would be like to be a Black person, a person of color, a woman of color, an LGBTQ person. What types of discrimination do you think they face in the world? For them to just read stories, hear stories, to know that these are things that people experience every single day of their lives. A lot of times people will still deny that and still be, in disbelief that this is something that's a reality. But at the same time, I think there are some who might be willing to listen. Most people will tell you that they know that racism exists, but they just don't think about it, or they just don't realize that it happens so often still. And I think when people are able to hear that others that they care about, their coworkers, their colleagues, the parents of their kids, the other people that they interact with on their everyday lives, that they experience this pain, the suffering every day of their life still, that hopefully that will encourage them to want to make some change, want to, make the world a little better so that their friends, their loved ones, and future generations don't have to experience those sorts of things.
I'm kind of chuckling because I'm thinking back, to the question I asked you about Republican Senator John Kennedy. This is an old white man.
Yeah.
Who says he wants a nominee that knows the difference between a law book and, a J. Crew catalog. And most of the women on this list are Harvard, Yale, Stanford graduates that have overcome so many obstacles to get where they are, have proven themselves 100 times over, are far more qualified than the white woman, Amy Coney Barrett, that's sitting on the court today, who went to Notre Dame. Thank you very much. That's not Harvard. That's not Stanford. So how do we start with a guy like that? And Republicans like him say we're overreacting, we're, being too dramatic, we're too sensitive, these words shouldn't cause this kind of pain. Donald Trump, that's his favorite line. Oh, he's just it's just hyperbole. That's how everybody gives him a pass for any and everything he says. And then they put it back on, the left or Democrats or progressives to say we're being too sensitive about this. So is there any hope for a John Kennedy?
Yeah, and I'm chuckling on this end because for me, sometimes I just think like there are some people that we shouldn't waste our time on because there are some people where that's wasted energy, right? But for those who we do think they might be able to hear, then maybe that's where we want to exert some of our energy. It kind of reminds me of just like, social media trolls. Like sometimes you just don't want to exert your energy on that. They're not going to change or they're going to continue to say whatever they're going to say anyway, right? So maybe I'm going to use my energy towards people who actually might meet me halfway or at least meet me a quarter of the way so that we can have these conversations. And I think the last thing I'll say is I think some people, we just have to find out what their link is, right? When it comes to like LGBTQ issues, for example, a lot of older people who are very set in their ways were completely unable to ever be pro-LGBTQ or even have any empathy for them. But what we saw, especially like in the past 10 years, if they had a grandchild that came out of the closet, if they had someone in their life who came out as LGBTQ and had a personal talk with them, that was their way that they could actually connect to understand. The problem with a lot of these white people is just they don't know Black people. They don't know LGBT.
I'm thinking we need to get John Kennedy a Black friend, right?
But I don't want to put any Black friends in that situation, right? So that's the other part of it, right? But that's just it. They grew up without having any exposure, any empathy to these communities. And so those might be lost causes. And so I would say channel your energy towards people who actually might be able to listen.
Great advice, Professor Nadal. It's been such a pleasure talking with you. So timely to be having this conversation. We're going to be hearing obviously a lot more about this lawsuit with former coach Brian Flores. You're going to see the NFL continue to deny that they have a diversity problem. So we're going to see more gaslighting. So this is a very, needed conversation so that when people hear the NFL say those things, they'll know that that's a form of microaggression in and of itself. They'll know that it's gaslighting. They'll be more discerning as they hear the pushback because it's going to come and it's going to be fast. It's going to be furious. And he's going to, quite frankly, probably see some of his, colleagues even turn against him because people are going to be thinking about their jobs, thinking about their salaries, their mortgages, their kids' college tuition, and protecting their own, positions, which it makes it even more difficult to fight discrimination. I can't tell you how many lawsuits I've been involved in where there were coworkers in the workplace who had heard the racist statements, who had experienced the conduct, but we couldn't get them to come forward because they were fearful of losing their jobs or, somehow being retaliated against. So this work is not for the faint of heart. So I thank you for doing it because when you stand up and speak truth to power, it makes a lot of people angry. They lash out because these are uncomfortable conversations that as a country, we're trying to have. But obviously, they continue to be difficult for a lot of people. But again, thank you so much for joining us this morning. One of his many books, Microaggressions and Traumatic Stress. Go to Amazon and find, the other works that he's involved in. And again, keep lifting your voice on this important topic. We need folks like you. So again, thank you.
Thank you very much.
My next guest is Mary Frances Winter. She is an expert in the field of diversity, inclusion, equity, and justice. She's the president and CEO of the Winters Group and the author of 6 books, including Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit. And she's a returning guest to the special report. Good morning and welcome back, Mary.
Good morning, and thank you so much for having me back. I appreciate it.
Well, this is so timely. This lawsuit filed yesterday by former Miami Dolphins coach Brian Flores, where he's alleging race discrimination on behalf of himself and coaches throughout the league, because this is a class action lawsuit that he filed. I want to get your response to what the NFL's response has been. Immediately, they issued statements saying the lawsuit was meritless. We expect that to happen when folks sue corporations, but they also talked about their tremendous commitment to diversity. But yet, one Black coach out of 27, 0 Black owners, and 75% of a league that's Black, but yet they can't somehow figure out how to get more Black coaches of these teams. So is this "we are committed to diversity" a common refrain that we hear from corporations, even when the numbers are inconsistent with diversity?
Absolutely. We hear that all the time throughout all of the work that I do. We are committed. And they have all of these statements that talk about the commitment, and they spend lots of money hiring folks like me to help them develop these statements. But it really is performative. We don't see the progress. We don't see the implementation because it's hard. So as Dr. Nadal just said, nobody is as interested right now today as they were in 2020 as it relates to anti-Black racism. As a matter of fact, one of my key clients, I won't name the organization, but if I did, you would know it. He said he's a Black man. He said he was told, you're dealing with this with too much Black stuff. We got to, it's all about Black stuff. We've got to get away from that. And so, yeah. And so I have another client.
Wait a minute, Mary. You're a diversity, inclusion, and equity specialist, almost 40 years in the business, stellar reputation, credentials, and you're trained to talk about Black stuff. And he says, don't talk about Black stuff.
Well, he was told, he's a Black man.
Right,
doing this work.
He's delivering the message from the
Right. So he was told by a colleague, a peer of his, who's also a senior vice president, that you talk too much about Black stuff. And then, so that was 3 days ago. Yesterday, I heard from a client, how did this session with the senior leaders go? And they said, well, it went fine, but they were wondering if we were going to talk about other dimensions of diversity other than, as it relates to Blacks and African Americans. However, Areva, they brought me in to talk about Blacks and African Americans, and it was a 3-hour session. So you can't even endure a 3-hour session where you talk about Black people without asking, so what about ageism? So what about, and all of these other issues are very important as well. However, it's like saying, if somebody's talking about prostate cancer, like saying, well, why are you still talking about prostate cancer? We need to talk about breast cancer. Well, they're all, we're not playing oppression of the Olympics.
Right.
It's not either or. Exactly. So yes. So it's and that's a microaggression or an aggression. In my book, I crossed out the part that said micro, and I just call these aggressions.
Yeah, I'm not laughing, obviously. I'm chuckling because we had this conversation 4 or 5 months ago, and you told me that things were starting to change, that you saw a regression, that you saw corporations stepping back from some of those commitments. I tell everyone the story that you said of someone asking you, do you have to use the word white? Because it was making folks feel uncomfortable to use the word white. Now they're saying, don't use white, don't use Black. I'm not sure, Mary, what your job is going to be. I don't know. You can't talk about white folks. You can't talk about Black folks. I'm not sure what they want you to talk about. But it's so disappointing. It's so, and what you heard Professor Nadal say, and I know you've said this over and over again, we don't dismantle structural racism by having a one-time diversity consultant or a one-time class or even a two-time class. We can't be constantly responding. How do we get folks to see that this is a proactive investment that has to happen on a regular basis, even absent some horrific video of a Black man being killed by a white cop?
Right. Yeah, it's systemic. It has to happen over time. And so we do have clients that we've been working with for 4 years and 5 years. I just got off of a call of a prospective client who we shared the work that we've been doing with someone in her same industry. And I said that we've been working with them for 4 or 5 years. And she said, well, how long do you all work with how long do you all work with clients? How long does this stuff take? Huh? How long does it take? Right. And so my chief operating officer was on, and because I had to get off to come here. And she said, well, it kind of takes as long as it takes. And it really does depend. And we want to build a capacity, want to help you build the capacity to take this work internally so that it becomes a way of work, so it becomes integrated in who you are. And it's not something that's, an appendage of what you do. It is what you do. It's integrated in what you do. Because we have issues with procurement, we have issues with all sorts of things. So let me give you an example of procurement, and let's talk. I don't know if it's a microaggression, but it certainly is an equity issue. So over the years, the companies that we work with, when we sign a master agreement, their payment terms have changed. They've gone from 30 days to 60 days to 90 days. We even have some companies that don't pay for 120 days. So that is a hardship for many small Black owned or women owned or, other dimensions of diversity owned companies. On the one hand, you have supplier diversity where you're saying we want to hire these companies. And then on the other hand, you say, but we're not going to pay you for 120 days. Right. Well, who does that benefit? Of course, it benefits the large company because their cash flow, they're keeping their cash. Who does it harm? It harms the small company because most times they don't have the cash flow to allow them to go 4 months. So this client, we sent them an email because they wanted to change our terms from 60 days to 120 days. In my email, I said, it's not particular hardship for us anymore because we can float that, right? But it may be a particular hardship for other organizations. And you're doing equity, from an equity lens, you should consider.
Let's do equity in this contract.
Yes. Exactly. And so they came back to me and said, well, but it's not a hardship for you. So what are you worried about? So I said, because we stand in solidarity with those companies for whom it is a hardship. And no, we do not want 120-day payment terms. We want to go back to your 60-day payment terms, even though it's not a hardship, for us. So those are the kinds of things that when you get into an organization, into their systems, one group is saying, we want to hire women-owned businesses. We want to hire Black-owned businesses. Fine, hire us. And the procurement people are saying, and we're going to pay you in 120 days.
Yeah, it's this disconnect, what you're describing. I'm a small business owner. I've been a small business owner, pretty much all my professional career. And I'm thinking back to having these very same conversations, getting large corporations to understand that if you're going to hire minority-owned companies, small companies, women-led companies, that you have to be sensitive to what that means, because otherwise you'll end up with no diverse companies, right? Because most small companies don't have the financial reserves, as you said, to go 4 months. And some companies, I've done a lot of work for governmental entities, they may not pay you for a year, an entire year, going through a process of a year, not getting paid, but yet they have, they're $500 million companies or $1 billion companies. So it's not an issue that they don't have the money, but they've just decided that this is the way that they make their books look better or they satisfy their shareholders, but no respect or recognition for what diversity means and how you create and sustain. Because it's not just bringing those companies in, it's then making it conducive for those companies to do the work. And that's one of the issues I want to talk to you about in terms of bringing in Black folks. And did you see, and I read your blog post where you kind of did a report card on corporations. This was, I think, late last year, you did this blog post and you went through and you looked at some of the commitments, the $50 million pledge. You looked at the companies that said they were going to dedicate 15% of their retail shelf space to Black businesses. Right. What kind of grade, just overall grade, would you give corporations? And then we can talk kind of more specifically about some that are doing worse and some that are doing better.
Yeah, I would overall give them a D. A D. A D.
This is after all the big press releases, all the black boxes on Instagram, all of the commitments that we heard from CEOs. You're saying a D.
Well, the CEOs.
So if you say a D, it's a D.
Right. And the CEOs are committed in the way they know how to be committed. But then they delegate the work into the organization. And they may delegate the work to, this job, the chief diversity officer. And unless that chief diversity officer is reporting directly to the CEO, and many times they are not, they're somewhere in HR and sort of, down in the organization, nothing is going to happen because you're going to get stalled at middle management. The 38 years that I have been in business, that's where you get stalled at middle management, the resistance. So what we've started to do with our organizations is we only want to work with organizations who recognize this resistance at the very beginning. So we're going to do some change management kinds of things and say, this is what's going to happen. You're going to hear people saying, well, I don't know how to do this, or, this is reverse discrimination, or what about white men? And we're going to hear all of this. We have to, at the very beginning of an engagement, we want you to know that this is going to happen, and we want to be prepared. We want to be proactive. How are we going to address that? Are you willing to put 3 years into this, knowing that that's how long it's going to take? And many organizations are still very much about the next quarter, and not willing to put the time in and the resources and the money. So the budgets are starting to fall away. So right after George Floyd, they're pretty much willing to pay anything you charge them for this work. And now people are coming back and saying, well, we don't have the budget. We don't have the money.
Right. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned, reverse discrimination. We've heard our former president call out the prosecutors who are investigating him and called the investigations racist, and starting to plant that seed for his followers that if he is indicted, that is somehow reverse discrimination, because the DA in Manhattan and the DA in this Georgia county both are African American. Are you starting to hear that more from white executives, white middle managers, these people you are training, that somehow conversation about Blacks is discrimination in and of itself? Because that clearly is a microaggression.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's more, it's more down at the more entry level leaders, the first line leaders, not so much at the higher end, but you hear people saying, well, what about white men? This is reverse discrimination. So I've always said there's no such thing as reverse discrimination. Discrimination is discrimination, because reverse sets up this idea. So can white men be discriminated against? Sure they can, right? I mean, you know better than I,
well,
right? What the law is.
They're not in a protected class.
They're not in a protected class. That is true. However, from an organizational perspective, so that's not the legal perspective, but when an organization says we are an inclusive organization and we treat everyone fairly and everyone is everyone. So from that perspective, the organization can set policies which say we treat everyone fairly. So what we do with that is we look at the statistics and the data, and 90% of the leadership is white men. 90% of the promotions, or the disproportionate number of promotions, have gone to white men. So how can you say that there's discrimination? You just look at the numbers, and it tells the story.
Well, that's what we talked about with the NFL. You look at their numbers, and this notion that they're committed to diversity is just not consistent. It's not logical. It's not proven by the data. I want to ask you about, in this blog post, you said that Black executives and white executives, when asked what the goal is for the company, or goal should be for the company, that they have very different goals about what the workplace should look like. Talk a little about what those differences are.
Yeah, so I think for white leaders, it's still really more about representation. For Black leaders, it's
what do you mean when you say representation?
Getting more Black people, getting more people of color into leadership roles, which we were talking about 38 years ago, I say 30, I'll be in business 38 years in March. So that's why I'm frustrated, because we were talking about that 38 years ago. We need to get more Black people into senior roles. So for white leaders, it's still about representation, lack of representation of Black people, people of color in leadership roles. For Black people, leaders, it's more about the experience. It's more about the culture. It's more about how I'm treated. That's where we get to the microaggressions, right? It's more about fixing a culture which doesn't allow me to thrive, because every day I am dealing with these microaggressions and I am fatigued, right? Hence Black fatigue. It's just tiring to always have to be dealing with the microaggressions.
Do the white leaders acknowledge this revolving door? Obviously, and I'm thinking again back to my experiences in corporate America, in particular in law firms, such a revolving door. So many junior associates get hired. Some of the big firms may bring in 10, 15, 20 first level law students as associates, pay them huge salaries, and 2 or 3 years later, they're gone.
Right.
You look, some of the big firms may not have any Black partners, which means none of those folks that came in to those entry-level classes stayed around long enough to make partners. So when you talk to these white leaders, do they at least recognize this revolving door?
Some do, and they recognize it from the perspective of, there are just so few qualified Black people that everybody wants them.
Mary, so they're not still saying they can't find qualified Black folks.
But there are so few.
Please don't tell me that.
They're still saying that the pool is so small that folks leave for a better deal, for better salary, for better money. And we know that it is not always about, I mean, of course, you want to be paid well, but it's not about the money. At the end of the day, no amount of money keeps people in an organization that's toxic and that's rampant with microaggressions, aggressions, and worse. People just say, well, we know the Great Resignation. 4 million people are leaving their jobs. And who's leading the way? Black women. Black women are disproportionately leaving their jobs more than anybody else. And starting their own businesses at 2 to 1 the rate of white women.
And are they saying they're leaving the workplace because it's toxic?
Yes. They're saying they're leaving the workplace because they're not supported, they're not mentored, they're not seen. They're not seen. And, we've got a pandemic. They've got perhaps children. They've got family issues. It's just not worth it. It's just not worth it to compound everything else that's going on in the environment and stay in this culture that claims to be working towards inclusion, and they're not seeing it.
I want to go back to the revolving door. So the white executives that say they want a representation, they want to see more Blacks or people of color in these jobs, but they can't find them. They can't find the qualified candidates. And I'm sure you've presented them with data in some situations where you've shown the number of Black hires that they've made and then the attrition rate for those Black employees that came into an organization. How do they rebut that? Because many of these organizations have sizable numbers of people that they hire on a yearly basis, but they don't stick around. So
they explain it that they're being stolen away by other organizations that can pay.
That's their explanation. That's the job, but right. they left for $1,000 or $10,000 more. They left for an increase.
Now they are beginning to recognize that in fact it is the culture. One of the issues with exit surveys, and most large organizations do not do a great job with exit surveys. They have these little boxes that you check. Better opportunity, moving out of the area, all of these kinds of things, but it doesn't really get at the culture of the organization. Some organizations are changing that, and they recognize they really need to get some reliable data about why people are leaving, why Black people are leaving the organization. The other thing that they do, Areva, is they spin the data. So they spin the data in ways that suggest that this attrition rate in this year, perhaps that was because we had a reorganization and we laid off a whole lot of other people. And so they're still really trying to figure out ways to spin the data so that it doesn't look so, doesn't look so bad.
Okay, Mary, what do we do? I know in your blog post, you talked about too, the time, the investment, the amount of time that this is going to take. And I think I read that you said, 5 years, you got to think about a 5-year strategic plan to really address this. Is that a realistic amount of time, or is that too short of a period if you're really trying to change the culture of an organization?
Well, I think 5 years is minimum, and 5 years are really, really aggressively committing to do this in a way that you are unapologetically being so focused, and you're being focused on asking those leaders why this is not happening. And so you have a leader, let's say, who has a group of 200 people that they're responsible for, right? So you break that down, you look at that data, and if you see that Black women in that particular organization, there may be only 4 or 5, but why are they not being promoted? And you're holding that leader accountable to tell you that there's something wrong with their performance. There's something wrong with that Black woman in terms of why she can't be promoted. That's organizations are looking at this data at a meta level, and we need to be looking at it at a micro level to really get down to, yes, Mary Frances and, Areva and, whoever else and, Marisha and all of the, I'm just using Black women as an example because studies show that Black women are at the bottom, relative to promotions and advancement in organizations. So we need to get granular and hold those leaders accountable. The other thing that we need to do is, as you're hiring leaders, what is that leader's record from the previous organization on diversity? Don't hire people because they have the best technical skills or because they're the best friends with some other senior, senior leader. We have to look at it from the perspective of what have they, if you're serious, what have they done in this area? What can they point to a success? And if they haven't had no successes, if they haven't thought about it, then they're not a candidate for that leadership.
Yeah, they're not likely to start thinking about it and start performing at that high level if that has not been a part of their track record in the past. I know you can't reveal the names of your clients. I'm not going to ask you to do that. But can you give us the names of one or two corporations that made a commitment after the murder of George Floyd, after the start of this kind of racial reckoning that we've been going through, that you think has been doing above a D? I'm not going to even ask for the A corporations or the Bs, but anybody that's doing slightly better than that overall D.
Yeah, so I am going to mention a client, and I'm sure that they're going to be okay because he's been really very vocal about it. And it's Cummins. Cummins, the engine people, right? Their CEO came out with a really, really bold statement, an anti-racism statement, that they were going to be looking into the criminal justice system. They were going to be looking into things that are not necessarily what Cummins does. And so we started to do some work with, we're doing lots of work with them, but when we started to do some work with them, there were some of his direct reports who were somewhat uncomfortable with some of the language and whatnot. So he had me come in, because my team's working on, I'm not directly on a day-to-day basis, but he had me come in to meet with his direct reports. This was my first trip after the pandemic was last October. And he had me talk with them about what this work was really about, address their concerns. There were like 15 of them. We had this, my mother would call it come to Jesus, meeting, right? Because he said, I'm not backing away. He said, I'm not backing away. He said, I need you all to understand this work in a deeper way, and we're going to do whatever we need to do to keep you all on board, because I think you're the right leaders. And it was a great conversation. So I would say, I'm not going to give them a grade, but they are in it for the long term. Mm-hmm. They're putting the investment in it. They're going deep into the organization, and they realize that it's going to take a long time. They realize that it's complex. At the end of the meeting, he said, let's just sit down, you and me, and just have lunch. And let me just talk with you about this. And so, so Cummins, I think, would be a company that I would name that we're working with that really, I think is doing this. I think some of the younger companies, so Cummins is old, they're 100 and some years old, but some of the new up and coming tech companies, I think, are serious about this and looking at this from that perspective as well. We've got a couple of clients, I won't name them. We've got a couple of clients in that arena that I think are, because you know why? Because they have a lot of millennials and Gen Zs in their workforce. And the Gen Zs in particular are demanding it. They're not having it.
What I love what you said about the Cummins president is that he leaned into it. He didn't let the middle managers tell him the direction of the company or the vision of the company. He, as the leader, which is what you expect leaders to do, said, we're going to lean into this as a company, and we're going to do whatever it takes for my downline to make the same kind of investment and to buy into this in the same way that he personally had. And we know that when leaders do that, whether it's productivity or sales or whatever that company has been tasked to do, when they know that it's a directive from the top, people fall in line or they get out, right? They leave.
Exactly.
If they can't get with the program, then they get out. And so, that's refreshing to hear. And it's refreshing to hear that there are some younger tech companies that are doing that work as well. Always a pleasure to see you, my friend.
So good to be with you.
Pushing those companies, we can't, that's the thing with this work, right? You just can't give up.
Can't give up. You can't give up.
An emotional roller coaster sometimes. You make a lot of progress and then you feel like you're regressing.
Absolutely. Yeah, you got to keep it going. But and then in the midst of that, recognize the burden and recognize the emotional toll. So today I am coming to you from Barbados. I am working for the month. I'm working for the month in Barbados because I need my sun and I need my beach. And but I'm still working. It's not a vacation per se. But it fills my spirit. This is my happy place. So I am in my happy place for the month of February.
And what better time to be there since they're having the nor'easter and all of that snow and cold weather on the East Coast. And I know you're on the East Coast. Enjoy your happy place. Keep doing the work that you're doing. Always good to see you again. Her book is Black Fatigue, How Racism Erodes the Mind, Body, and Spirit. It's Mary Frances Winters. Thank you, my friend.
Thank you. All right. Be well.
All right. What a great show. Thanks to my guests. Always enlightening when we have this conversation. I love guests who are willing to just tell it like it is. We cannot sugarcoat the issues around race in this country. And I think this lawsuit that's been filed by Brian Flores against the NFL is going to give us another opportunity. And I hope as Americans, we take advantage of this as an opportunity to talk about race and racism. And we look at those numbers in the NFL, and as much as we love our sports of football, that we don't give them a pass. Football, basketball, baseball, dance, law, medicine, whatever the industry is, we can't give them a pass. We have to hold them accountable. And it's totally unacceptable in 2022 to be talking about a league that has 75% of its players be African American and yet only have one Black coach. And then to have another a Black coach like Brian Flores show up for an interview, get a text message thanking or congratulating him on the job, only to find out that text message was supposed to go to the white guy that had already gotten the job before Brian showed up for what we now know is a sham. And yes, it is a sham interview. In the law, we call that pretextual interview. Because obviously the team had already hired the white guy. They had no intentions of hiring Brian. So hopefully that kind of evidence comes out in his lawsuit. I hope he's successful in that lawsuit. But I think more importantly, what I hope is that we continue to have this conversation about race and what microaggressions and what aggressions look like in the workplace, in the community, and sometimes even in our own homes. All right, some words to live by before I get out. When we know better, we must do better. And we know better. We know better. Mary Frances Winters has made that very clear, that the data is there. She's been doing this work for 38 years. The data is very clear. Companies know what they need to do. It's up to us to hold them accountable. All right, I'm out, y'all. Wear your mask, get your booster, be safe, and remember, we're all in this together.